Hello and welcome to Until Saturday, the Athletics College Football Podcast. I am your host for today, David Ubben, along with Seth Emerson here, who covers Georgia and the SEC for us at The Athletic. But be sure to follow this podcast on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to your podcasts. We're probably there. And that way, new episodes reach you as soon as they're released. And if you could also leave us a 5-star review and a 5-star comment, we'll get to it in a future mailbag episode. There's plenty to talk about in this sport. We'd appreciate it. You can also check us out until Saturday on YouTube. Just hit subscribe so that you know when new videos are published. Today, Seth, we got a lot to talk about. I should update our listeners. This is like a football and grits adjacent show. We're going to be talking SEC today. You can't find football and grits this year. My co-host and I, Brody Miller. That show will not be continuing this year, but I will be on the podcast quite a bit. Seth, I'm sure you will make some appearances as well from time to time. Today, we're talking SEC names to know. And Seth, this is more or less breakout guys. We can define breakout in many different ways. Some guys you've never seen play before. Some guys you might have seen somewhere else. Some guys have done a couple things and might be household names by the end of the year. You can define breakout. Your names you need to know in a lot of different ways. But we got 10 of them here, Seth.
Yeah. Your names, I have to say, like, to go behind the curtain here, your names, I'm not saying that I had to Google some of them, but let's just say that you went a little bit more like micro, and
the
very
transfer
well,
portal,
like,
baby.
if you pay attention to college football and recruiting, you knew all of the names David put in there, and
yes,
they're very good names. As you're going to basically know the names that I chose, but I wanted to talk about them. And maybe it was more for not even just an SEC audience, but like these are names that are going to be the household names in a way, or that I'm just curious about for the nation this year, which when you're talking about the SEC, that's the nation, or at least national interest.
Well, Seth, as any college football conversation must begin, we got to start with Dion, right? That's how I understand.
Wait, hold on. I know we're in a big realignment time. Should I check threads or
yes, Colorado
X
to the
or whatever?
SEC.
Yeah.
Yes.
Did I miss something?
Stay with me.
Okay,
My first name you need to know, Mr. Shane Hooks. He is better known as a wide receiver for the Auburn Tigers, but he is a graduate transfer from Jackson State who did not follow Deion Sanders, a.k.a. Coach Prime, to Colorado. Maybe he wanted to win a few more games, which I suspect Auburn will do. He's trimmed down about 15 pounds from last season, but I'm not going to say this is a through line of all of my picks, but I think experience is the best teacher. He played a couple seasons at Ohio, had about 35 catches there. Last season, though, at Jackson State, 64 catches, 748 yards, 10 touchdowns, led Jackson State in all of those numbers. Committed to Ole Miss initially. Auburn flips him, I think, like a week or so after that. And whether it's Robbie Ashford or Peyton Thorne throwing him the ball, Auburn needed receivers. They needed to upgrade, and you looked and you saw Hugh Freeze really go hard at receivers in the portal. And I don't think they got a better one than Shane Hooks. I think he can come in and make some noise immediately. As a grad transfer, he's trying to make some money. He's trying to get out there, play at the highest level. Is he going to catch, 80 balls, go for 1,000 yards? I'm not sure. But if he led Auburn in receiving this year, I'm not sure that I would be surprised. And grabbing a first team all SWAC guy, I think he can come in and make some noise. He's going to do it for some new Tigers this year. I think a good comparison for him, Seth, is he strikes me. He might be this year's Juice Wells.
I was looking up Juice Wells' stats, and that was going to be my contribution to this. And now you're
68
just
catches.
It. Yeah,
68 catches, 928 yards last year for South Carolina after moving up from James Madison. I think Juice might be an All-American this year. With another year
first
back.
team All-SEC last year, kind of quietly almost.
So that's sort of the comparison. And I think you're going to see him do some things. Again, 6'4", 190-ish. I think he played at like 205 last year. I'll be very intrigued to see what he can do going from the SWAC to the SEC. It's a big jump.
Yeah, it's I guess where it doesn't compare to Wells is Wells was going to an more established system, but he is also going to be working in with a transfer quarterback the way Wells was with Rattler last year. Yeah, it's almost going to be like a parallel kind of tale on how Deion's players from Jackson State are doing, because you're going to have some of them at Colorado, but then if Shane Hooks kind of blows up at Auburn, there'll be people saying, well, he didn't get the right guy. Or they all could just kind of be there. They all could be guys that are just interesting, but also it's just going to be Auburn's offense in general is going to be interesting to watch, and how immediate an impact Freeze's offense has. But he's I think a lot of people were expecting Auburn to take a big step on offense with Freeze in there this year, but man, they're doing it with a lot of new players. Especially
and question marks at quarterback. I think it'll be interesting to see what that offense actually looks like, because I think merging what Hugh Freeze does and bringing in Phil Montgomery from Tulsa, a lot of Baylor concepts, I think will find their way into this offense. And that offense, there's a lot of opportunity for receivers. I think you're going to see them have a bit of both, a bit of what we saw from Hugh Freeze, at Liberty and with Malik Willis previously, but also at Ole Miss. And I think, look at Hugh Freeze's history with receivers, A.J. Brown, Laquan Treadwell. When he gets the dudes, they do pretty well. I think he might have a dude here. Seth, who is your first name that we should know?
I'm trying to remember. Producer, show me who I put up. Who did I list first? Oh, was it Dominic Lovett? Okay, let's stay with transfer receivers. Okay, he's a actually well-known commodity around the SEC. So going with my theme of I'm not picking unknowns, but he's going to be interesting because he's a slot guy, and Georgia is known lately for tight ends, and they're known for using not so much the slot as much, and using more tight end, double tight end, and I still think they're going to. But Mike Bobo, as a new offensive coordinator, is going to adjust to his personnel the same way that Todd Monken did and would have this year. And Brock Bowers, by the way, is more of a flex out tight end. He's more of a positionless player. He's not really, he's a tight end, but he's not really a tight end. He's a positionless guy. He will be an H-back sometimes. He'll be a fullback. They'll hand him the ball, not very often, but like near the goal line. But so how much is Mike Bobo and Georgia going to flex out Brock Bowers when they also have Dominic Lovett? They could continue to do both. I think they will not attach Brock Bowers to the line as a traditional tight end and kind of take away what he does best. So there might be a lot of spreading out. And Carson Beck, who we all assume is going to be Georgia's first quarterback out there and have every chance the first month of the season to lock down that job, he's going to have a lot of weapons to throw to spread out wise. And Dominic Lovett, I don't know if it will translate to stats. Like, he's another one of those guys who, and this goes for Georgia in general, like offense and defense, you don't put up huge stats because they've got so many guys. But Lovett could make a bigger name for himself this year than he has at Missouri the last couple of years, because he'll be, obviously with Georgia's schedule, not right away, but as the season goes on, he'll be in some more high-profile games. He will make some more high-profile plays. He's a guy that has generated a lot of buzz when he got here in the spring, more so than the other transfer wide receiver, Ra Thomas from Mississippi State, and that was because of Thomas running into some off-field problems. But Lovett's a guy that I think is going to surprise people. But Georgia has a lot of those. They also have they still got Ladd McConkey hanging around. They've got some guys like Marcus Rosemy-Jackson, who's an outside guy, Arian Smith, who made that long touchdown catch and run in the Peach Bowl against Ohio State to spur Georgia's second half comeback. They've got a lot of weapons. Lovett is one to watch because I don't even know if he'd finish in the top 3 for Georgia receiving wise. He could be beat out by McConkey, Bowers, and somebody else. But he is a speed slot guy who, if he stays healthy, Georgia hasn't had that guy the last 2 years.
And I want to take some time. I've got my notes here together, Seth. I'm going to take about the next 20 minutes of the show to read you the entirety of Eli Drinkwitz's comments about Dom Lovett at SEC meetings, where you and I were in Destin this year. He was asked about the transfer. He said, "Really good player, great young man, high character man, works really hard. Obviously, was very good for us."
Yeah. He expanded on it a little bit in Nashville, but in Destin, he was very, like it was obvious he still had some bitterness there.
Speaking of one bitter transfer to another, Seth, my next guy on the list, we have Zakhari Franklin, another wide receiver from Ole Miss, a very intriguing late addition for Ole Miss. If you don't like Group of 5 football, which you should, he's a new name. If you do, you know him. You know this man, UTSA's finest. Nobody in college football has more catches than this guy coming into the season in their career. 262. Again, experience, a great teacher. 2-time All-UC USA, honorable mention All-American last year. A known entity across the sport, less so in the SEC. I think the NFL is maybe sleeping on him a little bit. I think he can make a bunch of money, especially in this offense this year. We saw the kind of year that Jalen Hyatt had in this offense, and came from a guy that wasn't necessarily on the NFL's radar to a first-round pick, if I'm not incorrect. 6'1", 185, but he can play the position. I think certainly it's worth talking about. He's also emblematic of a lot of the problems facing the sport of college football right now. He is what so many Group of 5 coaches complain about. Not him specifically, but him as a concept. They feel like they're the farm system to the rest of the sport, and he was a very, very, very surprising entry into the portal. He didn't enter until after spring ball, late April. If you're planning on moving up, like a lot of the G5 guys do, that's not typical. I won't use the T word because I don't have any proof, but certainly a lot of people presumed that he might be headed to Colorado when he went in the portal. He did not. All that stuff aside, he is a perfect fit for this offense. He really succeeds well or does well, excels when he gets to the top of that route. And in this offense, you're making a lot of reads. You're saying, hey, the corner's doing this, the safety's doing this. I've got to read that and make my move. That's probably the best part of his game. And I think he really is a great fit for this offense. I'm sure that they made that case to him when he gets that guy in space one-on-one at this, deep downfield. Bye-bye. There's a reason why he's got so many catches, and that just spells trouble for defenses. Huge pickup for Ole Miss, and they're rebooting like a lot of schools are, and in the portal era, you can never be too settled. You can always add a guy, and Franklin was a guy that a lot of people wanted for obvious reasons because production, experience, all those things. He might be. I personally would vote for Devin Leary, but Franklin might be the best portal pickup of anybody in the country this year.
Yeah. So far, we've talked about 3 straight transfer receivers, but from different levels, first to FCS, then within the SEC, and now Group of 5. Let me hop on what you said about Group of 5 coaches and others feeling like we're developing these players and then they transfer. And I get it. I'm sympathetic to that, but I like there should be no rule against it. Like the coaches can do it. They if you want to stop it, allow players to have contracts, make them employees, do what people are talking about. That's the only way you can attach these guys to schools. If it's America, man, if they have the ability to, because they showed out at one level, move up a level, and on top of it, get more money for it while their name is marketable, then they should have that ability. It kind of goes back to, I don't want to get into all the, should there be guardrails for this or that or whatever on NIL on this show, but like it gets back to what we talked about, why name, image, likeness rights should be there in the first place is because so many of these players, may not go on to the NFL, and this is where their name is the most valuable. And this is the time in their life when they get to cash in the most. And before July 1st, 2021, they weren't legally able to do that. and that wasn't fair. And now they can. And in addition, with the free transfer, like, you couldn't do that either. But before, I don't think it all happened around the same time, David. But do you remember, was it like 2020 or was it 2019?
I think
one-time transfer.
I think the one-time transfer came in right before NIL. And
right.
NIL certainly, the ability to entice with the cost of leaving being lower than ever. They've teamed up to really add a lot of instability to the sport, and it's certainly the coach's number one complaint. I find those complaints. I get it, but also you're paid a lot of money. You're a big boy. You'll be fine. So, it is what it is. And I don't think it's going to change anytime soon unless the rules change, which there doesn't seem to be. Besides portal windows, there doesn't seem to be much difference.
There's a lot of people that seem to be holding out hope that Congress is going to bail them out. And
good luck.
I think Ted Cruz was the latest to submit a bill today, which looks like it was probably written, by the certain powers that be in college athletics. But when you look at bills like that, you look at the Manchin-Tuberville bill, and then you look at the Chris Murphy one, and you look at all these, you're like, I don't think they're going to come together on anything. I don't, and no one has, by the way, like, reviewed the whole how a bill becomes a law thing. Like, there is a White House involved here that probably is not going to sign a bill that is seen as in any way curtailing the rights of young people. I actually asked Greg Sankey whether they've talked to the White House, and he says, well, we're not doing that yet until there's a bill, till there's a real bill, then you bring in the White House. And that kind of shows just how not far down the road they are on all this.
And I think we could all agree, Seth, anytime that there's a problem and then Congress gets involved, immediately sensible solutions, clarity, common sense is introduced into the equation. Every time. I've never seen Congress have any other outcome. So I'm sure this is going to go great for college sports.
And it's always great when you have a whole bunch of bills being introduced.
Yes, exactly.
To complicate it further.
Exactly.
All right. So I think we're staying on the receiver theme for me, but in non-transfer, Evan Stewart, which this one is obviously a name that everyone should know. If you follow the sport, he was a 5-star recruit. I chose him, and he had a pretty good freshman year at Texas A&M. I chose him because he may go under the radar because he just didn't make any news in the offseason. He didn't transfer. He had a solid season. He would have had a better season if Texas A&M had a more competent offense and stable quarterback situation. And we will see. But if Bobby Petrino, for all of his faults, he's good, calls a good game.
Man can call ball plays.
Yeah. And if he Cooper Wegman or anybody else, but soon it'll be Wegman, kind of keeps settles down the Texas A&M offense, and they have a competent offense, then Evan Stewart's got the ability to be an All-American.
I think you're right.
First team All SEC.
I think you're right. I think my next name, we got to stay on the A&M train. My guy Ruben Owens, excuse me, spelled like Rue the Day, not the sandwich. Number 2 running back in this class. A&M's got a huge hole in the backfield without Devon Achane, and you got to fill that. And I think Evans is a guy that has the ability to step in. There's a ton of opportunity there. We'll get to more guys who have a ton of opportunity in some surprising places later in my list. Really good feet, can shift really well in tight spaces. I don't think you can learn a ton from recruit highlight reels, but I think you watch a little bit of it. I'm not exactly a recruiting tape grinder guy getting out to camps, but I've seen enough of him to say, okay, I see it with this kid. You can also catch passes, great threat out of the backfield. Petrino loves using backs in the passing game. We've seen Jimbo do it too. But I think most importantly, A&M's offensive line, I think they can be a real strength this year. Last year, they really struggled. Inexperience and injuries, that's a bad combo, and A&M dealt with both of those. They've got 4 guys back. They've recruited well there. Don't be surprised, Seth, if that's one of, if not the most improved units in the conference, maybe even the country. You know, with inexperience and injuries, one of those is guaranteed to change. We know that they are going to be more experienced this year. If they can stay healthy, you know, I think Owens is the biggest guy that can really benefit from that. So I'm going Ruben Owens. Definitely a guy that has some potential to make a ton of noise. And if A&M, who I'm in on this year, makes some noise, he's going to be toting the rock quite a bit.
Yeah, I wrote a column from SEC Media Days talking about Texas A&M is probably the most intriguing SEC team, because I think there's this perception that vaunted NIL number 1 ranked class from a year ago was a bust and that a bunch of guys transferred. But if they signed so many good players that the ones that are still there are still like a really good core of players, and they're going into their second year.
Yeah.
And, you know, Owens wasn't part of that as a transfer, but like, if they settle down the offense, if they settle down the quarterback situation, you mentioned the O-line, they've still got really good D linemen there. What do Nick Saban and Kirby Smart do? They build their team around the lines, physicality, trenches. If you look at A&M's schedule, it's still hard in this last year of only a 14 playoff and an SEC West existing, where it's, you know, it's harder to play that schedule than it is the SEC East. Typically, it's hard to see them having the, you know, blow up, make the playoff year, but they could have a 10-2 type year, and people should be ready for that. Or the Bobby Petrino experiment backfires, and the issues that existed in that locker room last year because of that freshman class and guys getting money that they actually, some of the guys talked kind of openly about, surprised me in Nashville, they could continue and that team could crater. I don't know which direction it would go. I would lean towards they'll be improved. Like you're just kind of depending on Jimbo Fisher knows what he's doing ultimately. But, you know, we've seen better coaches flame out in college football, so you never know.
I think ultimately this team has the widest variance of any team in the conference. Talented enough to win 11 games, dysfunctional enough to lose 7. That's the A&M story, and we will see. But regardless of what happens, I think Mr. Ruben Owens gets his this year. Who's your next guy on the list, Seth?
Another, well, you know, if you know SEC football, you're like, well, of course we know this guy. He's not an under the radar guy. Quinshon Judkins from Ole Miss. He put up a lot of numbers last year, but again, almost quietly, like got overshadowed by everything else going on in the SEC. And you look up,
quietest 1,800-yard season in the history of college football.
It's almost like the Iowa State running back from a few years ago, Breece Hall. Like, that he puts up these big numbers and nobody kind of believes it. And some of that was just because it was Iowa State. This one, it's more like, well, it's Ole Miss, Lane Kiffin's offense. You know, they put up a lot of numbers, but a lot of numbers. And he's a guy that, like, when they put out these ridiculous, like, very early Heisman lists, you know, he should probably be on it. He's gonna, if he continues the progression from last year, he's gonna put up a lot of numbers, and people are then gonna look back at what he did last year too and go, oh, this guy's really good. And Ole Miss in general is going to be interesting. It always will be with Lane Kiffin there, but what he does at quarterback, how that all sorts out, and does Pete Golding figure things out for the defense? And all of a sudden, Ole Miss is the same team it was for the first half of last year, or are they the team that kind of faded? Faded maybe being a nice way of putting it in the second half of the season. But Judkins is a guy that, like I said, he was a very under the radar 1,800 yards, and people should know that name.
Well, I think part of it too is, you have Zach Evans in the backfield last year. Everyone's talking about Zach Evans. I thought Lane Kiffin did a nice job of sort of eliminating some of the noise around Evans and just letting him be a football player. And he was,
speaking of Dion,
pretty distraction. Yeah, pretty distraction free. Zach Evans' time at Ole Miss. But for Judkins to walk in as a freshman, where you have a guy that's, another 5-star back that's got more experience than you, and come in there, and I'm pretty sure Evans was banged up a little bit last year, but for Judkins to take the opportunity that he had and turn that into an 1,800-yard season, I mean, it is wild. I think he deservedly should be on the Heisman short list, and I do think, Seth, we don't need to get into the quality of Heisman voters. I have a lot of qualms with them. I think it's pretty silly in a lot of ways. Like, Heisman voters, one of the things that I think is very annoying that they do, and I am one, but I personally do not do this, is that they only hold quarterbacks accountable for teams' wins and losses, right? Like, if you lose, no matter what happened, well, that quarterback can't be considered for the Heisman. We saw this, I think the craziest example was Brandon Weeden at Oklahoma State. He goes into this Iowa State game as the clear favorite for the Heisman Trophy. They have obviously the plane crash the night before, where a lot of them lost a lot of friends and all of those things. They lose in double overtime on this insane. I think there was a kick that they missed that Quinshon missed at the gun of the fourth quarter. Just goes right over the upright. You move that 6 inches to the left, you might have a Heisman Trophy in Oklahoma State. But people say, well, we can't vote for him. I think he finished like 9th. And they lost that game, and they ended up, winning the Big 12 and winning a major bowl game, and he doesn't even sniff the Heisman. Well, Judkins, if Ole Miss goes 8-4 and Judkins has 2,100 yards, I don't think voters will hold that against him. For one, you have Ole Miss that historically has not been a power in the sport, and for whatever reason, people seem to care less about a team's record when it's a running back than when it is a quarterback. And I think that works in his favor. So we'll see.
You make a good point. And you don't offend me because I'm not a Heisman voter. Not because I refuse it. When I worked for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, a surprising fact for a lot of people these days, we were not allowed to vote in awards. And so I gave up the vote. And then when I came back to the Athletic, I just, at this point, I've never kind of pressed the person in my state to the person who runs it in Georgia, who dishes out the Heisman votes. I've never pressed them to get the vote back. Made it interesting last year when the quarterback in the town that I reside in became a finalist, and there was and there was like, well, he's just the starter for the best team in the country. That's the only reason. And I'm like, oh, I am, when it comes to the Heisman, I'm a player of the year guy. I'm kind of like you. It sounds like I'm like, who's the best player, period.
Yes.
Like, what position, tight end, whatever. And I told people, like, I've watched every Georgia game this year. Stetson Bennett's, he's deserving, but like, you looked at Judkins at the end of last year and you're like, that's a lot of rushing yards for an SEC running back. Like, that is impressive. And yeah, that's what I think. That's how I think it should be. I mean, there should be a high standard, but I would even consider, a group of 5 player that puts up huge numbers. I mean, maybe you want to see him do it against a couple good Power 5 teams along the way, but like, we should pick the best player for this award. It's supposed to be the best player, and we should pick best defensive player. If it is, some years, like 2 years ago, it might have been a defensive player and he didn't win.
Well, Seth, my philosophy is anytime that you can vote for the 4th best player on the national champion to be the Heisman Trophy winner, you got to do it. You got to do it. So, congrats to Heisman voters. We're going to keep it in the SEC East. The discussion in the SEC East anyway. I've been flying the Barion Brown flag for quite some time. I think he and Dane Key are kind of a 1-2 punch in Lexington, but it could not be lined up any better for Brown to go from promising freshman to a household name this year. I'm big on Kentucky. They get Liam Cohen back. They lose Will Levis, but they add the best quarterback in the portal in Devin Leary. Seth, can we get the calculator out? Can we talk some numbers? Briefly?
Go for it.
65% completion percentage, 3,433 yards, 35 touchdowns, 5 picks. That is Devin Leary in 2021. 66% completion percentage, 2,800 yards, 24 touchdowns, 13 picks. That is Will Levis under Liam Cohen in 2021. Do I believe that Devin Leary will be a step up from a second-round pick? My guess is yes. It's one of the reasons why I'm high on Kentucky. Leary was hurt last year, missed a ton of time. I think it took some of the hype off of him. But Brown is going to benefit from this. He's on the short list, I think, of probably the fastest dudes in the country. Still learning how to play the position, but he walked into kind of a tough spot last year. It did not go well in another year of Will Levis under Rich Scangarello. He still catches 50 balls, 620 yards, something like that. That's impressive, and I think he will also make an impact in the return game. I just think all of the stars are aligning for Barion Brown to have a massive, massive season and be a guy, 1,200, 1,400 yards. I wouldn't be shocked if you saw that at the end of the year.
If Kentucky has an explosive offense, things get interesting here.
Oh, yes.
Kentucky, the more we get closer to the season, I'm not going to say the more I'm down on Tennessee as the challenger to Georgia in the East, but maybe the more I'm like looking at Kentucky to the point where if it were reversed, like Georgia gets Kentucky in Athens and they go to Tennessee, if it were reversed and Georgia gets Tennessee at home again, but they have to go to Kentucky, you would look at it and go, like that gives you some serious thought. And I still have serious thought about Georgia going to Tennessee, but it's also like it's in November. We've only seen Tennessee blow up like that one year. So you have some time to say, are they going to do it again? Kentucky, meanwhile, is almost sneaky because they've never done it. Like they've had a lot of almost, but they've never won the East. They haven't beat Georgia since 2009. So there's just a lot of, I guess, skepticism. It's like, okay, well, we've heard this about Kentucky before, but Mark Stoops is a really solid coach. He's a defensive-oriented coach. They've always had a pretty solid defense. If they get an explosive offense and the ingredients are there, the question is whether it can happen right away. Like they've got Liam Cohen is back. He was there in 2021, but he was not there last year. So is there any level of adjustment, or does he just pick up where he left off in 2021? But Devin Leary is new. Does it end up being a little too much and we don't have an explosive Kentucky offense? But if we do have an explosive Kentucky offense, like I said, things get interesting in the East.
I'm in on Kentucky. I answer yes to all of your questions, Seth. Kentucky. I think that makes sense. Can they win the East? I mean, listen, Georgia's the best team in the country. So I don't think you can sort of say, well, Kentucky's got to win the East for us to take them seriously. I think you can win 9 games, 10 games. Can you get past Tennessee in the East, beat them, for the first time in a little while? Can you do that? That will go a ways in sort of determining how good this season is. If you win 9-10 games, you beat Tennessee, you finish second in the East. That's a heck of a season. And also, you're probably in a New Year's Six game again if you're Kentucky. So
yeah, but who cares? This makes me want the 12-team playoff to start now.
Yeah,
like we already.
I'd like to see them in the mix with a bunch of other teams.
I hate to be flipped.
Against
sorry
they have to go up against like a Big 12 champion or something.
Yeah,
that'd be interesting.
Can you name who was in the New Year's Six bowls last year?
Well,
don't ruin my point and name them. But when there's a 12-team playoff, you're gonna be able to name the 12 the next year.
Listen, your point is well taken, but I think that it is a cutoff for a lot of programs that say this is aspirational for us. If you get to a New Year's Six game, and I think with a bowl opt-outs, what happens in that game is kind of secondary. But if you can get there, that is a demarcation for, hey, we didn't play in one of the the Ricky, the ragtag bowls. We played in the real bowl games. And that says, hey, we were one of the dozen best teams in the country last year. I think that your point is well taken, but I think for the programs nationally, it might not matter, but for the programs themselves, hey, we've been to, 2 New Year's Six bowl games in 3 years. That is a real thing. So I do think there is some meaning there.
It's going to matter more.
The playoffs will.
Team.
You're hanging. A lot of programs are hanging banners for playoff appearances, and rightfully so.
As Kentucky and Tennessee and Texas A&M, which we've talked a lot about, would be 3 teams that would be so more interesting to me this year in a 12-team playoff, because you think there's a ceiling there with Tennessee, Kentucky, and Texas A&M. Like, they could have really good seasons, but you don't think they're going to break through and make the playoff and be either the SEC champion or the second team in. You think that that's coming out of Georgia, LSU, or Alabama. Could be wrong about that, but there's this less, that seems like a far off hope. In a world of a 12-team playoff, you're like writing in Georgia, 2 of Georgia, Alabama, and LSU at this point. And you're wondering which of those 3 is not going to make it. And you're wondering who else from the league is going to make it and take advantage. And you're talking much more about Kentucky, Tennessee, and Texas A&M, or whether an Ole Miss will come out. It's going to make, and then in 24, we also bring Oklahoma and Texas in to the mix too.
It's true. A lot of receivers on our list, Seth. Who's next for you?
The entire Georgia defense, because I want to talk about this from a personnel standpoint, because I think it's almost like a nameless group where like 2 years ago when you had this generationally great defense, Jordan Davis was kind of the face of the defense, but he was, it was Trayvon Walker, who not a lot of people talked about during the year, at least from a, in terms of the hype compared to Jordan Davis or even Nakobe Dean. It was Trayvon Walker who was the number 1 overall pick, but they all kind of meshed in a way to be this great defense, except for one game. And this year, 6 out of the 11 in the preseason all SEC defense first team was Georgia's defensive players. And I don't think that's realistic. I don't think it's going to work out that way. I think that's probably voters just kind of saying, oh, that's a Georgia player, I'm going to vote for him.
He plays for Georgia's front 7, so he must be good.
Right. But what I wanted to briefly do as someone who's, one of my jobs is covering this team, is just say, I think the names that you need to most know from that defense and the names that you might know a little bit later in the year. Michael Williams, defensive end. Like a lot of Georgia players, like Georgia never has a guy leading the SEC in sacks. Like they just, part of it is that there are so many of them that they just kind of, mix and match. Like this guy has a big game, this guy has a big game. Part of it is also like Georgia players aren't on the field very much defensively because they force so many 3 and outs. There's less chances for sacks and for tackles and picks and stuff. But Michael Williams, defensive end, has a chance to be a really good player and get a lot of stats, especially if Georgia is not having an edge guy who's putting up a lot of numbers. They don't have a Nolan Smith type guy this year who actually didn't put up a lot of numbers last couple of years, partly because of injuries too. Javon Bullard is a name that a lot of people already know. He was defensive MVP of both playoff games last year, and probably made the most consequential play of the playoff when he hammered Marvin Harrison Jr. at the back of the end zone and dislodged the ball. And it was initially ruled targeting, then it wasn't. A lot of Ohio State people, including Ryan Day, still think it was targeting. I don't think it was by the rule book. But if he doesn't make that play, Ohio State probably wins the game. And Javon Bullard is just a really good player. And he's going to move. He was at nickelback last year. He's going to move to safety this year. The other safety, Malachi Starks, was also preseason all SEC, but he was kind of a little, iffy later in the year. I'm curious whether he makes a big jump. And then the inside linebacker, Jamon Dumas Johnson, is just a hell of a player. And he's going to, I don't know if he's going to be suspended. He was one of those players. He was actually arrested for street racing for an incident a week before the January 15th crash. But the arrest happened like a month or 2 later. But I don't think it's going to be a long suspension if he's suspended at all. And when he gets back out there, he's a hell of a player too, and going to kind of, he may get a lot more stats this year because there's no Jalen Carter. There's no, continuing no Jordan Davis type nose tackle that's going to clog up the middle, and they don't have as many big names on the D-line this year. So I think you'll hear more out of the inside linebackers.
What do you make of some of the buzz around Nazir Stackhouse? Could you see him being a guy that people don't think is that Jalen Carter, Jordan Davis type before the season, just like a space eater who people are making cases for the Heisman Trophy. But we're sitting here in October, November, talking about this conversation we're having now, being like, I can't believe we just slept on Nazir Stackhouse. Zion Logue, I think, played more last year, but is that a guy that is that a possibility in your mind?
It is, but he probably I think he was one of the first team guys. That's a guy who is probably the most likely of those D linemen to pop this year. I'm not counting Michael Williams. He's exterior DN most of the time. But Georgia has a lot. Nazir Stackhouse is a interior lineman who's been around a while. And Georgia's got several of those. They've got him. You mentioned Zion Logue. They got Tramel Walthour, Tyrion Ingram Dawkins. They've got some freshmen, Jordan Hall, Jamal Jarrett, who a lot of these guys are going to get a lot of snaps. And so it may prevent a guy from emerging. Like going into last year, we knew about Jalen Carter. We've known about Jalen Carter for years. Going into the 2 years before, we knew about Jordan Davis. Devontae Wyatt was even, getting some attention. It may be hard for one of those guys to emerge, but maybe they do. And Stackhouse is the guy who's probably the most likely, although down the line, the guy who's probably going to be the best player from that group is Jordan Hall, but he's just a freshman.
It is interesting. I remember, I talked about this on Football and Grits, but I talked to some coaches that in last offseason who basically told me that they believe Jalen Carter was the best player on Georgia's 2021 defense, that had all the headliners that you had, Nakobe Dean, Jordan Davis, obviously Nolan Smith played a little bit more on those teams, all those guys. And they're like, no, Carter is better than all those guys. 2 SEC coaches told me that. I think that came to fruition in 2022. I guess we can debate 2021, but you don't hear quite that same buzz about anybody on this team, but you certainly, I mean, at the end of the day, like you said, there are limited opportunities in that front seven when you have recruited the way that you have and you have so much experience. But when there is opportunity, sometimes maybe that lights a fire under some guys and say, hey, it's my turn now this offseason. And maybe you're a different player, coming back. We'll see. It'll be interesting to watch. Seth, Nick Saban, I think for all of his greatness, and it's amazing. We're 40 minutes into this. We haven't talked Alabama at all. I don't think we even said the word. Nick Saban, listen, the greatest coach to ever coach in this sport. I do believe that. But at his core, he's still a DB coach. That is his specialty. I think people sort of forget that, especially with the offensive renaissance that they've had over the last 6 or 7 years, of which I think they're going to do some devolution, I guess, this year. Minka Fitzpatrick, Kool-Aid McKinstry. I think Caleb Downs might be the next one. The buzz out of Tuscaloosa about him is loud. And Saban's, he seems lately to kind of tamp it down a little bit, but there's a ton of opportunity at safety for Downs to step in and make an impact. He's the number one safety in this class. Young DBs can succeed in this defense. I think there's this perception, and it is true that Alabama's defense is very complex and difficult, and you got to do a lot of different things. But one of Caleb Downs' biggest assets is his brain. He is big at 203 pounds. I think he'll probably get bigger just by way of being in a power conference program, as most guys do. But that biggest asset is his brain. He can read and react, and far beyond his years. Look out for him. I think he's the guy that you could be talking about as, hey, this guy is a true freshman, and he might be one of the best players on this Alabama defense. Certainly I think Jordan Battle's gotten a lot of headlines coming in, but Nick Saban has a pretty good track record with freshman DBs, and I think Downs is going to be the next one.
Yeah, Georgia was going after him too. They got Joanel Aguero as kind of they would have taken both, but they got Aguero, another 5-star out of Massachusetts. It's kind of a consolation prize. If you're going to start at Alabama as a freshman on defense, it's the same thing as at Georgia, where for all the great recruiting they do, the luxury of stacking great recruiting classes on top of each other is you don't have to throw a lot of these guys in there right away. Like they come in as a 5-star freshman or top 100 ranked freshman or whatever, but you get to develop more because you don't have to start right away because you've got another 5-star or top 100 guy ahead of you. from a previous class, and he had to wait. And that's why Alabama and Georgia have become the machines that they are. That's why Alabama's been the machine, why Georgia is the machine, is because they do that over and over, which is to say, when a guy starts right away as a freshman. Now, I've seen freshmen start at cornerback. Tyson Campbell, now the Jacksonville Jaguars, started as a freshman at Georgia, and they eventually had to pull him. Cornerback is a tough spot when you're young, but safety's more interesting. Malachi Starks was a freshman starter in the latter half of last year at Georgia. And actually he had some bad moments. Like there were some times that, do you remember, was it the second half of the SEC championship when Garrett Nussmeier's
lit him
throwing up and down the field, and the camera was focused on Keely Ringo a few times after the play. And so a lot of fans naturally assume, oh, Ringo was the one who got beat because he was the one in the screen. Well, actually, Ringo was coming over, and it was actually Starks's play.
He tried to pass the guy off, and Starks is not there.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah. Well, Downs has to allay any concerns from Saban and defensive staff there that there would be any situations, some freshman mistakes like that. But yeah, I mean, he's going to be a hell of a player, and yeah, like I said, everyone in America wanted him.
For the brief 30 seconds where the national championship was competitive, who blew that coverage in the first quarter against TCU? Was that Starks as well?
Might have been. I don't even remember the play. It was, I don't know. I should remember the 7 from 65 to 7, but I don't.
Well, he didn't quite get in the end zone, as I recall. I think he got tackled at like the 10, but it was like, oh, you just don't see Georgia bust very often. So when you do, and it's in that stage, and it's against a team like TCU, who everybody just thinks they're going to manhandle.
Yeah,
it was like, oh, okay.
And to be fair, as I'm maligning Malachi Starks, he also made the play of Georgia's regular season when he ran down the Missouri player at the 1. And I think it was 13-3. I want to say at that point, it was something like that. And it was one of those plays where you're like, well, it's just, delaying the inevitable. But no, they didn't score at the goal line with 3 chances. And I believe had to settle for a field goal. Didn't have 5 downs in that game. And Georgia ended up winning. Now, it might have, you never know, might have won without it, but Malachi Starks made a great heady play like that, but struggled a little bit later in the year in pass coverage. Of course, when another team is throwing up and down the field the way an LSU is, because they know they've got no other prayer, the percentages are higher. You're going to give up a play here or there.
Well, Seth, let's keep it on the defensive side of the ball. Do not forget about our injured boys, Seth. Mr. Mason Smith, 2 A's. Yes. Mason Smith. There's no, we mentioned Jordan Davis, Jalen Carter this year, perhaps. There may not be one in college football. But if there is, don't be surprised if it's Smith. He's who I'd probably bet on. Somehow, I think people are sort of sleeping on him. I'm not sure how. He went down with a knee injury in the first quarter of the opener last year. I hope people didn't forget about him. Big stopper up front for the Tigers, who I'm high on this year. Go back and listen to our Hot Takes show. I may have some LSU thoughts. But 6'6", 315, he's the kind of guy where coaches go, they don't make very many of those guys in the country when you're recruiting. He carries it on his frame just like insanely well. Quick for his size, really powerful. Freshman All-American 2 years ago, really good head on his shoulder. He's going to have a lot of double teams this year. I'll be interested to see how he handles those. But Mason Smith, I think him, again, they also have Mekhi Wingo he's playing next to, which can help alleviate some of those double teams. Mason Smith seems like to me like he is bubbling up to a possible All-American season.
Yeah, it's almost like a delayed version of my Evan Stewart pick where big, you just kind of forget about him and didn't have he was overshadowed. Was Ed Orgeron's last year, 2 years ago? Yeah. It was overshadowed by all the chaos at the end of the Orgeron era. And then is hurt last year as LSU makes this big run. He's almost like a 5-star addition for Brian Kelly.
Everybody wants to talk about Harold Perkins, and rightfully so. I think Harold Perkins is the best defender in the country, this year. But Mason Smith, man, he's going to be a factor. Again, we're getting into why I'm so high on LSU. I just think you look around.
There's so many big names,
impact players, like everywhere.
They've got the first team quarterback in Jaden Daniels, and it's LSU. You know that Orgeron, for all his faults, recruited well while he was there, and Kelly comes right in. Like they're going to have depth, right? I mean, we would assume that they're going to have. That's the thing that we're talking about. When you talk about Bruce Feldman's story about Michigan, and we're going to have all these draft picks, and so the pushback to that is, okay, maybe you've done well and you're going to have good players, but what's your depth? That's what separates Alabama, Georgia, LSU from everyone else right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it separates Alabama and Georgia from LSU too. I think LSU, if you want to give me the starting 22, you can make a pretty strong case that LSU is the best team in the country. They do not have the same level of.
You don't think they have the depth? Okay.
I
was assuming it because their recruiting has been good.
They have good depth,
fairly consistently good.
Yeah, they have good depth, better than most of the country, but not to the level of Alabama and Georgia, where our starting left tackle went down. Let's plug in our other 5-star left tackle. They're not quite to that point. But Seth, I feel like we've allowed folks to learn a lot of new names in the SEC. Keep an eye on some dudes. It's a fun show. I'm excited for this season. I really can't wait. This is going to be. I can't really put my finger on it. I'll be doing a bunch of Dion stuff, so maybe that's part of it. But I'm as excited for this season as any in quite some time. I'm like not really. It kind of feels like going back to school in some ways, where you're like, we got to load up for this 3-month sprint. But I am very excited. So we'll see all these guys on the field. Hope they all stay healthy. Thank you guys for tuning in to Until Saturday. Again, for Seth Emerson, I am David Ubben. Be sure you're following the podcast on Apple or wherever you listen to podcasts, Spotify, all that stuff. You can be notified immediately when new episodes are up. We'll be doing an episode every single day, every single weekday leading up until the season. We always appreciate a 5-star review or a comment. If you leave those, we can hit them up in a mailbag episode coming up. So leave us a review and a comment. And be nice, people. There's some mean ones out there. Did you know that there are people that are mean on the internet, Seth? I've learned this. It's not very nice.
I'm trying to wean myself off social media, which is tough because our job depends on it sometimes.
Yes.
Not so people can see our work so much anymore, but so we don't miss news. But yeah. People are mean there.
Well, you'll be updated when new videos publish if you subscribe to us on YouTube as well. And I'm very excited. You'll be able to hear myself and Ari Wasserman quite a bit live on Saturday nights throughout the season. As soon as the games are done, we'll have some Pac-12 After Dark, I'm sure, on our screens while we're watching.
While the Pac-12 still exists.
Well, yeah.
Let's enjoy it while we still have it.
Pac-9 After Dark. We'll see. But remember, you can't spell Until Saturday without us. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for tuning in. We'll be back again tomorrow with another show.